He didn't answer her calls. Not once. Elena Moretti lay on a hospital gurney, her body tearing itself apart from the inside, her phone pressed against her ear for the 14th time in 2 hours. And Damian Moretti, the most feared man in New York, the man who had once promised to burn the entire city down before he let anything touch her, was simply not there. He was drinking champagne with another woman, while his pregnant wife screamed his name into an empty phone line. If that were you lying in that hospital bed, alone, terrified, bringing a life into the world with no one holding your hand, what would you do when he finally came home carrying flowers and a practiced smile? Because Elena Moretti made a decision that night. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't make noise until it's already too late to stop it. If this story already has your blood boiling, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and follow Elena's story all the way to the end, because what karma does to Damian Moretti is something you will not want to miss. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The last morning Damian Moretti spent in his own home, he left without saying goodbye. That wasn't unusual. Elena had learned not to expect it. In 8 years of marriage, she had quietly filed away hundreds of small disappointments the way other women collect recipes, carefully, without complaint, tucking them somewhere they couldn't cause any more damage. The cold side of the bed at 3 in the morning, the anniversary dinner she'd eaten alone after it went cold, the baby shower he'd promised to attend, and then something came up, and he sent a $100,000 wire transfer instead, as if money was the same thing as presents. She told herself it was the life. You married a man like Damian, you accepted the life that came with him. But that Friday morning in October, Elena was 38 weeks pregnant, swollen in ways that frightened her a little, exhausted in ways that went deeper than sleep could reach. And when she heard the front door close behind Damian at 6:45 a.m., she pressed her palm flat against the swell of her stomach and breathed. "It's okay," she told the baby. "He'll be back Sunday." He had told her it was a business trip, Atlantic City, something about a property deal that couldn't wait. She didn't ask follow-up questions anymore. Not because she was stupid. Elena Moretti had a graduate degree in business law and a mind sharp enough to cut glass, but because she had learned that asking certain questions only produced lies. She then had to pretend to believe, and the pretending cost more energy than she had left. She let him go. She went back to bed. The first contraction hit at 11:47 that same morning, and it was different from the Braxton Hicks she'd been feeling for weeks. This one had weight to it. Intention. Elena sat up slowly, breathed through it, checked the time. Probably nothing. The doctor had told her first-time mothers often panic too early. She made herself a cup of decaf tea and sat at the kitchen island and waited. The second contraction arrived 18 minutes later. Still, she waited. She was practical. She didn't want to be the woman who called her husband every 5 minutes over a false alarm. She didn't want to give him any reason to look at her like she was being hysterical. That look, the slightly impatient, slightly amused look Damian sometimes gave her when he thought she was overreacting, she had been trying to avoid that look for years without quite realizing it. The third contraction came at 12:22, 11 minutes apart, consistent, real. She picked up her phone. Damian Moretti did not answer the first call because his phone was in the bedroom and he was on the villa terrace with his second glass of Prosecco, and he didn't feel like moving. This was not something he ever admitted to anyone, including himself. In the story he told himself he was a man who was always in control, always making calculated decisions. The Don of the Moretti family didn't let wine and a woman make him stupid. He made choices, deliberate ones. The villa belonged to a business contact who owed him a favor, a sprawling white structure built into the cliffs above the water, the kind of place that existed specifically so men like Damian could pretend, for 48 hours, that they were not men like Damian. Her name was Valentina Cross, 31 years old, former model, current ambition. She had been in Damian's orbit for 6 months in that slow, calculated way some women entered powerful men's lives. Never pushing, never demanding, just being consistently, effortlessly available. She wore expensive things casually. She laughed at the right moments. She never mentioned Elena. When Damian's phone buzzed on the marble table, he glanced at the screen. Elena. He picked up the glass instead of the phone. It wasn't cruelty exactly, or at least that's what he told himself. He would call her back in 20 minutes. He just wanted 20 uninterrupted minutes. Was that really so much to ask? He had spent 8 years building an empire that kept her in a 12-room mansion on the Upper East Side with a private security detail and a budget that most small nations would envy. 20 minutes on a cliff with a glass of Prosecco. That was not a crime. The phone stopped buzzing. He exhaled. I went back to whatever Valentina was saying about the boat she wanted to rent in the afternoon. Elena tried again at 12:34. Then at 12:51, when the contractions were 8 minutes apart and she was gripping the kitchen counter. Then at 1:03, when she had moved to the bedroom to lie down because standing felt impossible. She wasn't panicking. She was past panicking. She was in that cold, clear place that came when the body understood that something serious was happening and the mind had to catch up. Between contractions, she was completely calm. During them, the world went white. She tried his personal cell, then the secondary number he used for family. Then, because she was getting genuinely frightened, she called Marco, Damien's head of security, a man with the face of a retired boxer and the loyalty of a well-treated dog. Marco answered on the second ring. Mrs. Moretti, everything okay? I'm in labor, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later, even though there was nobody to tell. I can't reach Damien. Can you get a message to him? There was a pause on Marco's end that lasted exactly 1 second too long. Of course. I'll reach out right away. Do you need a car? Please. 20 minutes, and Mrs. Moretti. I'll find him. He didn't find him, or rather, he found him. But a message was passed through a chain of careful hands, and somewhere in that chain, someone decided that the dawn should not be disturbed unless it was an emergency. A wife in labor apparently did not clear that bar. Elena arrived at St. Catherine's Medical Center at 1:47 p.m. In the back of an armored SUV driven by a security guard named Felix, who was 24 years old and deeply out of his depth. He offered to come inside. She told him to wait with the car. She walked through the emergency entrance alone, one hand on her stomach, the other holding her hospital bag, and she gave her name to the intake nurse with the steady, expressionless calm of a woman who had decided she was going to hold herself together no matter what the next several hours brought. The nurse looked at her chart, then at her face. Is someone meeting you here? My husband is on his way, Elena said. She believed it when she said it. The labor room was functional, clean. There was a window that looked out on a gray October sky and a parking structure. Elena lay in the adjustable bed with the fetal monitor strapped around her middle and her phone on the pillow next to her face, and she kept calling. 2:15 p.m., no answer. 2:43 p.m., no answer. 3:01 p.m., straight to voicemail. He had turned his phone off. She put the phone face down on the pillow. The nurse, a woman named Diane, 50s, efficient, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, came in to check her dilation and noticed the phone face down and the expression Elena was not quite hiding. First baby? Diane asked. Yes. Labor can take a while. He might still make it. He might, Elena agreed. Diane patted her hand and left, and Elena turned her face toward the window and looked at the parking structure and breathed through a contraction that lasted 90 seconds and felt like someone trying to pull her inside out, and she did not cry. She was very clear with herself about that. She was not going to cry in this room alone where no one could see it. Not tonight. She would allow herself to cry later. At the villa, Damien was on the boat. Valentina had convinced him that the afternoon was perfect for it. Clear sky, low wind, that particular quality of October light on the water that makes everything look like the opening shot of a film about people who have more money than problems. He had borrowed the boat from the same contact who owned the villa. It was a 40-foot cabin cruiser with a teak deck and a small crew of 2 who had the good sense to stay at the front. He was not thinking about Elena. He was not thinking about the baby. He was not thinking about the missed calls, because his phone was in his jacket pocket in the cabin below, and he had silenced it before they left the dock, because Valentina had made a small comment about men who couldn't put their phones away, and Damien Moretti had not lived 52 years and built a criminal empire by letting a woman tell him what to do. But somehow the phone ended up silenced anyway. He had a drink in his hand and the sun on his face, and he was, in some shallow corner of himself, genuinely happy. That was the detail he would never be able to fully explain later. Not that he'd missed the calls, not that he'd been with another woman, but that he had been happy, undisturbed, at ease, while his wife was alone in a hospital bed, while his child was deciding to enter the world without him. He was happy. The baby was born at 7:32 p.m. Elena pushed for 3 hours with Diane and a young resident named Dr. Kaur beside her. She held Diane's hand during the final stage because there was no one else to hold it. She didn't ask for anyone. She didn't make any requests. She simply did what her body told her to do, with a focus that Dr. Kaur would mention to a colleague the next morning as one of the most remarkable displays of controlled composure she'd ever seen in a delivery room. The baby cried immediately, loud, offended, absolutely certain that something unjust had just happened to him. Elena laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised and wet-edged, the kind that could have turned into crying but didn't because she didn't let it. They placed him on her chest. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. A full head of dark hair. His father's jaw and his mother's eyes, though she didn't know that yet. She held him and looked at his face and understood, with absolute clarity, 2 things simultaneously. The first, that she loved this child with an intensity that was entirely new, something she had no previous category for, a feeling that made every other strong feeling she'd ever had seem like a rough draft. The second, that she was done. Not angry, not hysterical, not planning revenge or composing speeches, just done. The same way a structure is done when its last load-bearing wall comes down, quietly, inevitably, without drama. She had called her husband 14 times while she was in labor. He had not answered once. That was not a mistake. It was not an oversight. It was a choice. And she had watched Damien Moretti make choices her entire adult life. And she knew the difference between a man who got distracted and a man who simply decided something didn't matter enough. Their marriage, she understood now, had not ended tonight. It had ended a long time ago. Tonight was just the moment she finally saw it clearly. She kissed the top of her son's head. He smelled like something ancient and inexplicable, like the beginning of something rather than the end. "Hi," she whispered to him. "I've got you. I promise I've got you." Damien's phone came back on at 9:14 p.m. 41 missed calls. 14 from Elena. The rest from Marco. From his consigliere Richard Fenn. From his sister Camille. From numbers he didn't recognize, which turned out to be the hospital. He stood on the villa terrace in the dark with the phone in his hand, and the calls arrived in waves. Missed call notifications stacking up on the screen like an indictment. And for a long moment he simply stared at them, the way a man stares at a wreck on the highway when he's been going too fast to stop. He called Elena first. She didn't answer. He called Marco. Marco answered on the first ring, and his voice had a quality Damien had never heard from him in 12 years of service, something careful and tight, like a man choosing his words with extreme precision. "She had the baby, Don Moretti. A boy. They're both healthy." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. "When?" 7:32. Damien did the math. He'd been on the boat, somewhere around the second drink, maybe watching the sun drop toward the water, maybe laughing at something Valentina said. He didn't remember exactly, but the timestamp was clear enough. "She's at St. Catherine's?" "Yes. I'm heading back now." Another pause from Marco. "Of course." There was something in those 2 words that Damien would think about later. Not anger. Marco was too disciplined for anger. Not judgment, exactly. Just a very slight, very deliberate withdrawal, like a man taking one small step back to let something pass. Damien hung up and stood in the dark for another minute. Valentina appeared at the terrace door in a silk robe, sensing the shift in temperature. "Is everything okay?" "I have to go," Damien said. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He packed a bag in 11 minutes and was in his car before midnight, driving back toward New York through the dark, rehearsing what he was going to say. Not to Elena, not yet, but to himself. Building the version of events that he could live with. Yes, he should have answered. Yes, the timing was terrible. But the baby was healthy, Elena was fine, and these things happened. He would be at the hospital first thing in the morning with flowers and a real conversation and whatever she needed. He could fix this. He had fixed harder things than this. He did not know, driving through the dark, that the woman in the hospital had already made a decision he would spend the rest of his life trying to reverse. He didn't know that fixing this was no longer possible. He didn't know that the empire he had spent 30 years building was about to be brought down not by a rival family, not by a federal indictment, not by any of the enemies who'd tried and failed over the decades, but by the quiet, devastated, diamond-hard resolve of a woman he had left alone in a delivery room. He turned on the radio. He drove through the dark. He didn't know anything yet. Damien arrived at St. Catherine's Medical Center at 2:17 in the morning, carrying a bouquet of white peonies he'd had his driver stop for at an all-night florist in Midtown, because showing up empty-handed felt wrong, and showing up with flowers felt like the correct shape of an apology, even if he hadn't fully assembled the apology itself yet. The night nurse at the maternity ward looked at him the way night nurses look at men who arrive at 2 a.m. with flowers, without surprise, without warmth, with a kind of professional neutrality that somehow felt worse than open contempt. "Elena Moretti," he said. "My wife." The nurse checked something on her screen. "Room 14. But visiting hours, I'm her husband." A pause. The nurse picked up the phone on her desk, murmured something into it, waited. "Put it down. She's asked not to be disturbed tonight." Damien stood very still. In 30 years of running the Moretti organization, very few people had told him he couldn't go somewhere. The ones who had generally regretted the decision in ways that ranged from financial to medical. This was a maternity ward night nurse in Queens. He breathed in through his nose. "She just had a baby," he said. "I'm the father." "Sir, I understand. She's requested no visitors until morning. If you'd like to leave the flowers, I can make sure she gets them." He looked at the flowers in his hand. White peonies. $140 at 2 in the morning, which was the kind of detail that felt significant when you were standing in a hospital corridor, being turned away from your own wife's room. He left the flowers at the desk. He sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes, in a chair that was built for function rather than comfort, beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, and he stared at the linoleum floor and tried to organize his thoughts into something that resembled a plan. He was good at plans. He had built an entire criminal organization on the strength of his ability to assess situations quickly and respond with precision. This was not that complicated. He had made a mistake. He would acknowledge it. Elena was reasonable. They had been through difficult things before and come out the other side. This was fixable. He kept telling himself that until a nurse came to tell him that visiting hours began at 8 a.m. and suggested he might be more comfortable at home. He left at 3:10 in the morning without seeing his son. Elena heard from Diane the next morning that Damien had come. She absorbed that information the way she'd absorbed most things in the past 12 hours, quietly, from behind a glass wall she'd put up somewhere during labor, and hadn't yet decided to take down. "The flowers are at the nurse's station if you want them," Diane said, checking her chart. "White peonies. Very pretty." "Thank you," Elena said. She was sitting up in bed, her son asleep in the bassinet beside her. She had been awake for most of the night. Not from pain exactly, but from something that felt like her mind refusing to shut off. Going over things, cataloging things, arriving at conclusions she'd been avoiding for longer than she wanted to admit. She looked at her son's sleeping face. His name was going to be Lucas. She had decided that alone, in the dark, somewhere around 4 in the morning. They had discussed names during the pregnancy. Damien had opinions, of course. Damien always had opinions. But Elena had been partial to Lucas since the beginning, and now there was no one in the room to negotiate with, and the baby looked like a Lucas, and so Lucas it was. She picked up her phone. Not to call Damien. She opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't dialed in almost 2 years. Catherine Hughes. The city's most formidable family law attorney, a woman who had once been described in New York Magazine as the divorce lawyer that divorce lawyers are afraid of. Elena had met her at a charity event 3 years ago. They had talked for 20 minutes over mediocre canapes, and Elena had come away thinking, "I hope I never need her," followed immediately by, "I should save her number anyway." She had saved it. She stared at it now. Lucas made a small sound in his sleep, a tiny, involuntary noise, like he was commenting on something in a dream, and Elena felt that violent newborn love clench in her chest again. She pressed call. Catherine Hughes, because she was the kind of woman she was, answered on the third ring, even at 7:48 in the morning, and said, "Elena Moretti," in a tone that suggested she was not entirely surprised. "I need a consultation," Elena said, "as soon as possible. I have an opening Monday at 2. I'd like to come today if there's any way." A brief pause, the sound of pages turning. "I can do 11. My office. And Elena, bring whatever financial documents you have access to. Digital copies are fine." "I'll be there," Elena said. She hung up. Lucas opened his eyes, looked at her with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, and she reached over and put one finger in his palm. He gripped it immediately, reflexively, with a strength that was slightly startling. "Okay," she said softly. "Here we go." Damien arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with a second set of flowers. Roses this time, red, the kind of choice that revealed more than he intended about where his head was at. and a rehearsed expression of genuine contrition that he had been refining during the 45-minute drive back to the hospital. The room was empty. Not empty. Elena was there, sitting in the chair by the window with Lucas in her arms, dressed and alert. But the room felt empty of whatever he'd been hoping to find. She looked at him when he came through the door, and her face did something he couldn't immediately read. Not anger, which he'd been prepared for. Not tears, which he'd been braced for. Something quieter, better, more expensive. "You came," she said. "I'm so sorry." He said it immediately, because it was true, and because he needed her to know it was true before anything else. He crossed the room and looked at the baby and felt something move through him that he hadn't anticipated, a wave of something enormous and terrifying that he didn't have a name for. His son, 7 pounds, dark hair, sleeping with his mouth slightly open against Elena's arm. "Elena, I'm so sorry." "Sit down, Damien." He sat in the chair on the other side of the bassinet. He put the roses somewhere, on the windowsill, he thought, though he couldn't remember doing it. "I need you to be honest with me," Elena said. Her voice was completely level. That levelness was more alarming than shouting would have been. "Just once, today. I'm not going to scream at you. I'm not going to make a scene, but I need you to be honest." "Anything. Were you with a woman?" The pause that followed was probably less than 2 seconds, but felt geological. "Elena, don't say my name like that. Just answer." He looked at his son's sleeping face. "Yes." She nodded, just once, like she was confirming something she already knew, filing the confirmation away. "How long?" "It doesn't matter." Damien, still level, still quiet, but something in it that made him stop. "How long?" 6 months. She didn't react visibly to that. She looked down at Lucas and adjusted him slightly in her arms, a small, practical gesture, and then she looked back at Damien with an expression he would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. "I called you 14 times, she said. "I know." "I was in labor for 6 hours alone." "I know." "I held a nurse's hand because there was no one else." He didn't say anything to that. There was nothing to say. He knew. "I want you to hold your son," she said, "because he didn't do anything wrong and he deserves to have his father hold him on his first morning. After that, we need to talk about some things, okay?" He reached out and took the baby, carefully, with the stiffness of a man who was afraid of breaking something precious. Lucas shifted and made that same small commenting sound. Damien held him and looked at his face, and his eyes went bright in a way he couldn't control and didn't try to. "Lucas," Elena said. "His name is Lucas." Damien looked up at her. "We talked about, his name is Lucas," she said again. Pleasantly, firmly, like she was telling him what time it was. He looked back down at his son. "Lucas," he said quietly. "Okay." The conversation they had after, the real one, the one Elena had prepared for while he was driving back from wherever he'd been, lasted 40 minutes and was, by Damien's later reckoning, the most controlled devastation he had ever sat through. She didn't yell, she didn't list his failures in the theatrical way he'd been half expecting. She spoke in paragraphs clearly, the way she might have presented a legal brief, and what she laid out was not so much an accusation as a verdict. She told him she had loved him, past tense. She said it just like that, without flinching. She told him she had spent 8 years making herself smaller so he could feel larger, and she had done it willingly because she'd believed they were building something together. And now she understood that she had been building while he had simply been occupying the structure she built. She told him she was not going to ask him to change. "I don't think you can," she said. "Not really, not in the ways that matter, and I'm not interested in spending another 8 years watching you try and fail. Lucas deserves better. I deserve better. So we're going to do this in a way that's clean and quick and doesn't require either of us to pretend." "Elena." He leaned forward. "I made a terrible mistake. I know what I did. I know how bad it is. But I'm not going to just let our marriage end because of one. It wasn't one mistake," she said. The quiet in the room after that was complete. "I know about the woman before Valentina," she said. The name landed on the table between them like something dropped from a height. She watched him absorb it. "I've known for a while. I was going to bring it up after the baby was born, and we were somewhere stable, and I thought I was strong enough to have the conversation. And then last night happened, and I realized I was never going to be strong enough because there isn't a version of this that doesn't break something." Damien's jaw worked. "How did you—" "Does it matter?" He stopped. I need you to leave, she said. Not forever. You're Lucas's father, and that's not something I'm going to try to take from him. But I need you to go home, and I need you to contact Richard and tell him to cooperate with whatever my attorney requests, because I would like this to go quickly and quietly. Your attorney. He said it like the words were in a foreign language. I made some calls this morning. He stood up. Not in anger. Or not only in anger. He stood up because sitting felt like conceding something, and 30 years of instinct told him to stand up. You're making decisions on the morning after our son was born. You made your decision months ago, she said. I'm just responding to it. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he hadn't looked at her in a long time, and saw something he recognized from a very different context. He saw it in men sometimes, across a table, when a negotiation had ended and they just hadn't said it out loud yet. That settled quality, that absence of the thing that makes people keep arguing. She was done, not tired, done. Elena. His voice came out different than he intended, rougher, more honest. I love you. She looked at him with something that might have been sadness, or might have been further back than sadness. I know you think that's true, she said. He left the hospital at 10:45 a.m. In the elevator on his way down, alone, he stood with his hands loose at his sides and stared at the brushed steel doors, and felt something move through the foundation of everything he thought he understood about his own life. A small, deep shift, like the very first tremor before an earthquake that hasn't happened yet. He told himself it was temporary. She was emotional. She had just given birth. Monday would be different. He would talk to Richard. He would get his own attorney. He would begin working on winning her back the way he worked on everything else. Methodically, patiently, without accepting failure as a permanent outcome. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. He walked out into the October morning and called Marco and said, "Bring the car around," and stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets while the October wind came down the street cold, and he thought about his son's face, about the grip of tiny fingers, about the name he hadn't been consulted on, and underneath the shock and the grief and the calculations already running in the back of his mind, there was something else. A small, cold feeling he didn't look at directly. Something that knew what she knew. Something that understood what he was only beginning to suspect. That some things, once broken at the foundation, do not get rebuilt. Richard Fenn was 58 years old, had served as Damien's consigliere for 15 years, and had survived in that position through 3 family wars, 2 federal investigations, and one particularly catastrophic disagreement with the Calabrese faction in 2019 that had cost 7 lives and required 6 months of careful maneuvering to resolve. He was not a man who scared easily. He was sitting across from Damien in the study of the Moretti mansion at 1 p.m. that same afternoon, and he was choosing his words with the specific precision of a man who was scared. The situation with the Ferraro territory, he started. What about it? They've moved on the Flatbush operation while you were away. The pause before away was infinitesimal. Damien heard it anyway. How far? 2 blocks. It's symbolic at this point. But Sal Ferraro doesn't do symbolic. This is a message. The message is that they think I'm distracted. Damien said it flatly. No question in it. A man reading a situation he'd been reading his whole life. The message, Richard said carefully, is that news travels. About the hospital. About the other thing. The room got very quiet. Say what you're saying, Richard. Richard put his hands flat on the desk. He was the only man alive who sat at that desk without Damien's permission, which told you everything about the nature of their relationship. Not friendship exactly, but something that had calcified over 15 years into something harder and more functional than friendship. 3 of the captains came to me this morning, before I even knew you were back. DiMaggio, Torrance, and Reyes. Came to you with what? Concerns. Richard didn't look away. Credit to him. About leadership. About judgment. About whether the stories going around are true. What stories? Damien. Richard's voice went flat in a way it almost never did. Your wife was in labor alone for 6 hours. People know. It's the kind of thing that, it's not just personal. It goes to who you are, what kind of man you are. And in this business, who you are and what kind of man you are is the only thing holding 47 people's loyalty in place. Damien stood up and walked to the window. The Manhattan skyline in the afternoon. He had bought this view. This exact view from this exact window. He had decided years ago that he wanted this precise sight line, and he had built the financial and structural machinery to acquire it, and for a long time standing here had felt like evidence of something. "Tell DiMaggio and Torrance and Reyes to come in Monday," he said. "I'll talk to them." "That's not—" Richard stopped himself, restarted. "Damien, I need you to understand something. They didn't come to me to ask for a meeting. They came to me because they didn't want to come to you. That is a different thing." Damien turned from the window. "They're questioning me." "They're testing the temperature of the water," Richard said. "There's a difference. Right now. In a week, if nothing changes, there might not be." Damien studied him. Richard didn't flinch. They had been through enough together that they could look at each other directly when it mattered. "And you?" Damien said. "Are you testing the water?" "I'm telling you the temperature," Richard said. "That's still my job. But I need you to hear me when I tell you that what happened last night, it's not just a marriage problem. It's already a problem for this organization. And it's going to get worse before you have a chance to make it better." Damien sat back down. He was quiet for a moment. "What are they saying specifically?" "That a man who leaves his pregnant wife alone on the night she delivers isn't thinking clearly. That a man who isn't thinking clearly can't be trusted to run an operation where unclear thinking gets people killed. That's a significant leap. It's their logic. I'm not endorsing it. I'm reporting it." Richard leaned forward slightly. "And Damien, the Ferraro move today isn't a coincidence. Someone talked. Someone in our own circle flagged your absence and they took advantage of it within 24 hours. So we also have a loyalty problem, which is a different problem than the captain's, but connected." Damien absorbed that. The different layers of it, the way each layer revealed another underneath. He was good at this. At reading the architecture of a crisis, finding the load-bearing points. He had always been good at this. "Find out who talked to Ferraro," he said. "Already working on it." "And DiMaggio, reach out. Not a meeting, something casual. Dinner. He'll read the dinner as weakness. He'll read an ignored phone call as confirmation that I'm rattled. At least at dinner, I'm in the room." Damien's voice had shifted into the register he used when he was running operations. Lower, more deliberate, stripped of everything unnecessary. "Set it up. Wednesday." "All right." "And Richard." Damien's eyes were level and very cold. "The men who came to you this morning, I'm not angry they had questions. I understand the instinct. But I need you to be very clear with them. Their concerns were heard, they will be addressed, and if a second conversation becomes necessary, it won't be in your office. It'll be in mine." Richard nodded once. I understood exactly what that meant. He'd been translating that particular sentence for 15 years. Understood. He left. Damien sat alone in the study for a long time. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. Or maybe it had always been this quiet, and he just hadn't been in it enough to notice. Elena had been the one who made noise in this house. Not loud noise, but human noise. The particular ambient sound of a person who lived somewhere rather than just slept there. The sound of her moving around in the kitchen at 7 a.m. The television on low. Her voice on the phone with her sister in Milan. He noticed the absence of it now. He looked at his hands on the desk. He thought about calling Valentina and decided against it. Not now. That situation needed to be managed carefully, and he wasn't in the right headspace to manage it carefully. And the one thing you didn't do with a woman like Valentina, smart, ambitious, unhappy with anything that looked like being sidelined, was make a careless move. He would deal with Elena first, then the captains, then Valentina, in that order. He had a plan. Plans, in Damien Moretti's experience, were the antidote to the feeling that things were out of control. You built a plan the same way you built anything else. Start with the foundation. Work up. Be methodical. Don't skip steps. He had never encountered a problem that couldn't be reduced to a series of addressable steps. He didn't understand yet that the foundation had already been removed. The photographs were published on a Tuesday. 11 days after Lucas was born, 10 days after Elena had left the hospital to stay with her sister Carmen in a brownstone in Brooklyn that Damien didn't have the address for yet. 8 days after Elena's attorney, Catherine Hughes, had sent the first formal communication to the Moretti family's legal representatives. A document that Damien's attorney described on the phone as aggressive, thorough, and clearly the work of someone who has done significant preparation. 8 days into all of that, someone posted 17 photographs to 3 different social media platforms. The photographs had been taken at the villa, from a distance, from a specific angle, with what appeared to be professional equipment. They showed Damien and Valentina on the terrace. On the boat. In the kind of proximity that left nothing ambiguous. The timestamps were embedded in the metadata. The timestamps matched the night Elena was in labor. By the time Damien's social media team contacted him at 6:47 a.m., the photographs had already been shared 42,000 times. By noon, they had been picked up by 2 tabloids, a celebrity news site, and, most damagingly, a financial journalism outlet that ran the photographs alongside a piece about Damien's legitimate holdings and included language like pattern of poor judgment and questions about leadership stability. By that afternoon, 3 investors in a hotel development project had sent emails requesting calls. The calls were brief. They were pulling out. A total of $68 million in legitimate investment gone in one afternoon's worth of phone calls, because the men with the money had read the same articles and made the same calculation that investors always made when a powerful man's personal life became public chaos. They didn't care about the morality. They cared about distraction, about risk, about whether the man at the top of the structure was going to be spending his cognitive bandwidth on a crisis instead of on the project they'd given him $68 million to focus on. The answer was obvious. They left. Damien sat in his office at 4 p.m. and looked at the photographs on his laptop screen and felt something he hadn't felt since he was 23 years old and new to this business and genuinely uncertain whether he was going to survive a particular night. He felt the ground move, not metaphorically, not as a dramatic image, a physical sensation, something in his chest and his stomach that was specifically the feeling of a man who has spent 30 years making the ground solid enough to stand on and is now feeling it shift beneath his feet. He called Valentina. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was careful in a way that told him she already knew. Of course she already knew. "The photographs," he said. "I didn't," she started. "I'm not asking if you did it. I'm asking who did." A pause. "I don't know." Valentina. "Damien, I swear to you I don't know who—" "Then I need you to think very carefully and very quickly about who was at that villa, who knew we were there, and who might have had access to the positions those photographs were taken from. I need that list. Today." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Is this the part where I disappear from your life?" He hadn't expected that question to land the way it did. Not because it was dramatic, because it was flat, matter of fact. The voice of a woman who had considered the possibility long enough that she wasn't shocked by it. "I need the list," he said. She hung up. He stared at the screen. The photographs looked worse every time he saw them. Not because of what they showed, he'd made peace with that, or told himself he had, but because of the timestamps. That was the part the internet had latched onto, not the infidelity. The timestamps. The visible proof that he had been on a boat in the afternoon sun while his wife's calls went to voicemail, while a night nurse handed his wife someone else's hand to hold. That was what people couldn't get past. That was what turned a private betrayal into a public verdict. His phone buzzed. Marco. "You need to see something," Marco said when he answered. His voice had that same careful quality it had at the hospital. Only worse now, stripped down to the functional minimum. "What?" "We found who talked to Ferraro." "And?" A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "It's Reyes." Damien sat very still. Captain Anthony Reyes had been with the Moretti organization for 11 years. He ran the Northern Territories. He was one of the 3 men who had gone to Richard with concerns. He was, Damien had always believed, one of the most reliable people in the upper tier of the organization. "You're certain," Damien said. "The source is solid. 2 independent confirmations." "Where is he now?" "At his place in the Bronx." Damien looked at the photographs on the screen, at the timestamps, at his own face in the frame, relaxed and unaware and completely confident that the life he'd built was exactly where he'd left it. "Don't move on him yet," he said. "I want to talk to Richard first." "All right." "And Marco." He paused. "How many people know it was Reyes?" "Right now, 4, including me and you." "Keep it that way." He hung up. He put the phone on the desk. He thought about Reyes, about the dinner on Wednesday that Richard had set up, which Reyes had attended, sat through, eaten food, made appropriate conversation, looked Damien in the eye, and talked about territory management and personnel issues, all while having already made a separate arrangement with the Ferraro family. 11 years. He thought about Elena's voice in the hospital. "I need you to be honest with me. Just once. Today." He thought about the way she'd said, "His name is Lucas," like it wasn't negotiable. He thought about $68 million and 17 photographs, and the small cold feeling he'd had standing on the sidewalk outside the hospital that he hadn't looked at directly. He was looking at it now. The feeling said, "You have been building on sand for a long time, and you convinced yourself it was concrete, and now the tide is coming in, and you are standing here watching it, and you still think you can stop it." Damien Moretti had survived 30 years in a world where miscalculation meant death, had built an empire from the ground up through a combination of intelligence and will, and the specific kind of controlled ruthlessness that keeps men afraid without making them desperate. And for the first time in those 30 years, sitting in his office in the late afternoon with photographs of his worst decision spread across his screen, he understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical. He had not lost control of this situation. He had given it away. And the man who gives something away and the man who has something taken from him face entirely different problems, because one of those men has somewhere to put his anger, and the other one has to sit with the fact that it was his own hand that opened. His phone buzzed again. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "Check your email. Moretti Commission correspondence. Thought you should see it before they send the formal notice." He opened his email. He read what was there. He put the phone down very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone to know. The Commission, the governing body of 5 families that had kept organized crime in New York, structured and functional since before Damien was born, had called an emergency session. The subject was the Moretti family's operational stability. The subject was whether the current leadership was fit to maintain its position. The subject, reading between the lines of the careful formal language, was Damien himself. He had known this was possible in an abstract way. He had known that the photographs and the investor withdrawals and the Reyes situation and the Ferraro move were all signals that could add up to something serious if he didn't get ahead of them. He just hadn't expected them to add up this fast. 4 weeks ago, he had been the most feared man in the city. Tonight, he was a man sitting alone in his office reading an email about his own potential removal, and his wife was in Brooklyn with his son and wouldn't take his calls, and his mistress had hung up on him, and somewhere in the Bronx a man who had eaten his food and spoken his name respectfully for 11 years was making arrangements with his enemies. He sat there for a long time. Outside the window, the city did what the city always did, moved and lit up and made its noise, indifferent to any individual's version of events, carrying on with the magnificent, terrible neutrality of something too large to be affected by any one man's mistakes. Then he picked up his phone and called Richard. "We have a problem," he said when Richard answered. "I know," Richard said. "I got the same email." "How bad?" A pause. The kind of pause that contains an answer but is deciding how to deliver it. "Damien," Richard said, and his voice had something in it that Damien hadn't heard in 15 years of working together. Something careful and tired and not entirely on his side. "It's bad." The commission meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Richard told him this on the phone at 9 in the evening, speaking in the measured, stripped-down cadence he used when the information was bad enough that dressing it up would only make it worse. The session would be held at the Arcadia Club in Midtown, neutral ground, technically, though everyone who knew anything about the commission understood that the Arcadia was where the Genovese family had preferred to conduct business since 1987, which made it about as neutral as a courtroom in the defendant's hometown. 5 families, 5 seats. And Damien Moretti summoned to stand before them and explain himself. "What exactly is the agenda?" Damien said. "Formal language says operational review." Richard paused. "Informal language is what you'd expect. They're going to move on my territories. They're going to discuss the stability of the Moretti position. The formal action, if they decide to take one, would be a supervised transition." "Supervised transition," Damien repeated it like he was tasting something that had gone bad. "That's a polite name for a takeover." "Yes," Richard said. He didn't soften it. That was the thing about Richard after 30 years. He had lost the habit of softening things, and Damien had always valued that about him. Tonight it felt like a different thing entirely. "I have until Thursday," Damien said. "You have until Thursday." "Then I need the week." He hung up and stood in the center of his study with the phone in his hand and looked at nothing in particular and did what he almost never allowed himself to do. He let the full weight of the situation settle on him without immediately reaching for a plan to displace it. Just for a minute. Just to know exactly how heavy it was. It was very heavy. Then he put the phone in his pocket and started moving. The meeting with Anthony Reyes happened on Wednesday morning at 7 a.m. in a private room above a restaurant in Astoria that the Moretti family had used for sensitive conversations for the better part of 2 decades. The room had no windows. The walls were old brick. There was a table, 4 chairs, a single overhead light that cast everything in a slightly jaundiced yellow. Damien arrived first. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the door, and waited. Reyes came in at 7:04. He was 53, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that defaulted to a neutral expression and stayed there regardless of what was happening internally. He had run the Northern Territories for 11 years with a competence that Damien had never had cause to question. He sat down across from Damien without being told to, which told Damien something about how Reyes was reading the morning, confident, or performing confidence, which in this kind of room amounted to nearly the same thing. "Don Moretti," Reyes said. Damien looked at him for a moment without saying anything. He had learned a long time ago that silence in a room like this cost the other person more than it cost him. "Tell me about Ferraro," Damien said. Something moved across Reyes's face. Not panic. Too controlled for panic. A calculation, fast and visible to anyone who knew what to look for. And Damien had been looking for exactly that his entire adult life. "I'm not sure what you've heard." "Anthony." Damien's voice was completely flat. "I didn't bring you here to give you the opportunity to decide how much I know. I brought you here because I already know, and I want to hear what you say about it." Reyes was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he put his hands on the table, a deliberate gesture, unhurried, the hands of a man who had decided something before he walked into this room. "It was a precaution," he said. "A precaution. The situation has been unstable. People have been nervous. I made contact to feel out whether Ferraro had any intentions that we needed to know about." He said it smoothly, with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed it. "Intel gathering. It's what you'd want done." Damien looked at him. "You went outside the organization," Damien said, "without authorization, to have a conversation with a competing family about the state of my leadership." He paused. "And you're calling that intel gathering. I'm telling you what it was. And the Flatbush move? 2 days after your conversation with Ferraro?" For the first time, something shifted in Reyes's posture. The shoulders dropped 1/4 of an inch. Nearly imperceptible. Not imperceptible. "That was Ferraro testing. That was Ferraro walking through a door you opened," Damien said. He said it without raising his voice, which was the most dangerous version of himself, and had been since he was 23. "You told him I was distracted. You gave him the temperature. He took 2 blocks as a demonstration that the information was worth paying for." Reyes looked at him. "How much?" Damien said. "I didn't—" "Anthony." Still flat. A wall. "How much?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had something animal in it. The specific quality of air in a room where something irreversible is about to happen, and everyone present can feel it. 200, Reyes said. $200,000. 11 years of loyalty. $200,000 to tell Sal Ferraro that the most feared mafia boss in New York was too busy managing the fallout from his personal life to watch his borders. Damien breathed in slowly through his nose. "I'm going to ask you one more question," he said. "And I need you to understand that your answer to this question is the only thing in this room that matters right now." Reyes waited. "Are you the only one?" A long pause. "Torrance has been talking to people," Reyes said finally. "Not Ferraro. The Calabrese side." Damien closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "Get out of my city," he said. "Today. Whatever you have here, site, close it, sell it, walk away from it. I'm not going to have this conversation again." Reyes stared at him. "You're not—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "I expected something different from this conversation." "I know," Damien said. "That's why I had it this way." Reyes stood up. He buttoned his jacket, a weird automatic gesture, something his hands did because they needed to do something. He looked at Damien one last time with an expression that was hard to read and left the room without another word. Marco, who had been standing outside the door, came in. "Follow him," Damien said. "Everything he does today. And get Torrance's location." "Done," Marco said, and left. Damien sat alone in the room with the single jaundiced light and the old brick walls and the table with 4 chairs, and he thought about the specific mathematics of betrayal, how you could account for enemies, But the calculation broke down when it came to men who had sat across from you at your own table, eaten your food, accepted your money, and quietly decided that the cost-benefit had shifted. He thought about Elena. I didn't mean to. But she arrived in his mind anyway, the way she had been arriving in his mind at unexpected moments for 11 days. Not the version of her he'd been trying to reach by phone. Not the woman sitting in the lawyer's office reviewing documents. But the version from 8 years ago, when they were newly married, and he had believed with genuine certainty that he was the kind of man who deserved her. He wondered when he had stopped being that man. He wasn't sure he could identify the exact moment. That was the problem with gradual erosion. It didn't announce itself. You just looked down one day and found that the ground you thought you were standing on had been becoming something else for a long time without your noticing. He stood up. He had a commission meeting tomorrow. He had Torrance to deal with. He had $68 million in withdrawn investment to account for. He had a divorce attorney who, by all accounts, was currently building a legal case with the thoroughness of someone who intended to leave nothing on the table. He had a son he had held for 20 minutes. He needed to focus. He went to work. The commission session began at 2 p.m. Thursday and ran for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Damien had been to many commission sessions over the years, had run them, had spoken at them, had once delivered a presentation that redistributed territorial authority across 4 boroughs in a way that no one in that room had seen coming, and everyone subsequently accepted because the logic was airtight and the alternative was visibly worse. He had always been, in rooms like that one, the person with the most control over the temperature. Today, he was the temperature. There were 5 men across the long table from him. Sal Ferraro, which was its own particular insult, there in a room that was supposed to be neutral. Vincent Capello, from the Capello family, old, quiet, watching everything with the patience of a man who had survived by waiting. James Trask from the Trask organization, 3rd generation, Harvard-educated, wore his suit slightly too well. The Calabrese representative, a man named Bruno, who had the specific blankness of someone who had been told not to speak unless spoken to. And seated at the center, running the session as senior member, Victor Amadei. Amadei was 81 years old. He had been a presence in New York's underworld since before most of the men in the room were born. He moved slowly and spoke slowly and had eyes that made you feel, regardless of your own standing, slightly exposed. He looked at Damien and said, "Sit down, Damien." Damien sat. What followed was not a shouting match. It was worse than that. It was a methodical, structured review of the Moretti family's recent operational record, conducted in the dispassionate language of men who dealt in consequences rather than feelings. And what it added up to was this. In the span of 30 days, the Moretti organization had lost significant legitimate capital investment, suffered a territorial incursion, experienced 2 confirmed instances of internal betrayal at the captain level, and generated the kind of public attention, the photographs, the tabloids, the financial press, that endangered every organization the commission represented. Ferraro didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence at the table was the statement. Damien answered their questions. He was precise. He was controlled. He laid out his response plan. The Reyes situation handled, Torrance being monitored, a strategy for reclaiming the investment losses through alternate channels, a plan for the Ferraro territory incursion that involved pressure points Sal would understand. He spoke for 40 minutes, and it was, by any objective measure, a strong presentation. Clear, evidence-based, the kind of thing that, in a better month, would have ended the conversation. Victor Amadei listened to all of it. Then he said, "The photographs." Damien had known this was coming and had prepared for it anyway, and was discovering that preparation and readiness were not the same thing. "A personal matter," Damien said, "entirely separate from—" "Nothing is separate," Amadei said. He said it gently, which was somehow more effective than if he'd said it hard. "You know this. You've known this since you were 23 and you came to see me for the first time. We don't have personal matters. We have the organization and we have everything that affects the organization. And right now your personal matter is on the cover of 3 publications. And everyone from our investors to our adversaries is reading it and drawing conclusions." "I understand, and I'm—" "Your wife left you," Amadei said, still gentle, still exact. "While she was carrying your child. She left you and she hired Catherine Hughes, which tells me she intends to be thorough, and she will be public. And every month that this divorce proceeds is another month that Damien Moretti is in the news for reasons that have nothing to do with his business and everything to do with his judgment." The room was very still. I'm working on a resolution, Damien said. What kind of resolution? I intend to speak to Elena, personally. I believe that a reconciliation. She'll reconcile? Ferraro said. He said it with just enough of a smile that it wasn't technically contemptuous. Just enough. Damien looked at him. I wasn't talking to you, Sal. Gentlemen, Amadei said. Damien returned his eyes to Amadei. I believe a private resolution is possible. It would take time. Time, Amadei said, is the one thing we're asking you about. He folded his hands on the table. Old hands, spotted but steady. The commission is not here to take your organization, Damien. That's not what this meeting is. What this meeting is the five of us telling you that we are watching the situation and that if it continues to deteriorate, we will have to have a different kind of conversation. Do you understand the distinction? Damien understood the distinction perfectly. A warning, formal, witnessed, on the record, and a clock that had just started. I understand, he said. He left the Arcadia Club at 5:47 p.m. Into a gray November afternoon, Marco 2 steps behind him, and he stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air and did not allow his face to do anything. He had been given a warning. The most feared man in New York had been given a warning. He got in the car. The thing that broke him open happened on a Friday. Not the commission, not Reyes, not the financial losses or the divorce proceedings or the Ferraro situation or any of the large formal catastrophes that he could see from a distance and respond to with planning and movement. It was a Friday afternoon 3 weeks later, when Damien was in his car outside the Brooklyn brownstone where Elena was staying with her sister, not doing anything, just there. He had driven there without entirely deciding to. Marco had said nothing, which was its own form of communication. He had been there for 20 minutes when the front door opened. Carmen came out first, Elena's sister, pulling a coat on. Then Elena, in a gray sweater, carrying Lucas in the infant carrier strapped to her chest, adjusting the strap with one hand while saying something over her shoulder to Carmen, and in the natural winter afternoon light she looked like a person who had been taken apart and put back together slightly differently. Not broken, not diminished, but rearranged in some way that made her look more herself than she had in years. Lucas was awake. His head was turned outward, taking in the street with the baffled intensity of a baby encountering the world, and even from across the street and through a car window, Damien could see the dark hair and the small jaw, and something in the set of his eyes that was going to be something specific someday, and wasn't yet. He watched them walk down the sidewalk. Elena said something and Carmen laughed, and Elena's face did the thing it did when she laughed at something Carmen said. That surprised quality, like the laugh caught her off guard, and she put her hand up to cover it slightly the way she always did, the gesture she'd had since before Damien had known her. He sat in the car and watched his wife and his son walk away from him down a Brooklyn sidewalk in the afternoon, and the thing that moved through him was not anger or grief or the particular organized despair of a man assessing a crisis. It was the plain, unmediated understanding that he had had this and he had thrown it away. Not lost it, not had it taken. Thrown it away. With both hands. On a cliff with a glass of Prosecco and his phone in his pocket. He didn't call Marco to drive. He didn't do anything for a while. He just sat there. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Valentina. He had been avoiding her calls for 2 weeks, not out of cruelty, but because he didn't have the cognitive resources to manage that situation while managing everything else, and he had told himself he would call her when he had space to handle it properly. That was what he told himself. He answered. I need to talk to you, Valentina said. Her voice was different from its usual register, tighter, something running underneath it. Now isn't... It needs to be now, she said. Damien, I need to talk to you now. Something in her tone pulled his attention fully. He sat up. What happened? Not on the phone, she said. Can you come to the apartment? I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks and it's important. It's... Please. The please was what did it. He hadn't heard Valentina say please before and he understood that it cost her something, which meant the situation cost her something. An hour, he said. He didn't look back at the sidewalk as Marco pulled away. He should have. Valentina's apartment was on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown with views of the park and furnishings that managed to be expensive without quite achieving warmth, which Damien now recognized as a quality of the woman herself, polished, curated, and somehow slightly cold when you got close enough. He had not been here in several weeks, and standing in her living room, it already felt like a place he'd been a long time ago. She was dressed, which he noted only because she usually wasn't when he came over. Dressed and standing rather than sitting, with her arms crossed and a quality of agitation that she was working to contain. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He sat anyway, on the white sofa, which he'd always found slightly too architectural to be comfortable. "Tell me." She looked at him for a moment. She was beautiful, he thought, in the clear-eyed way that a man can acknowledge a thing without being moved by it anymore. Objectively beautiful, and he had been moved by it 6 months ago. And now he was sitting on her white sofa thinking about a gray sweater and a woman's laugh on a Brooklyn sidewalk, and wondering what exactly he thought he had been doing here all this time. "I want to tell you something," Valentina said, "and I need you to hear it completely before you react." "Go ahead." "The photographs," she said. "I know who took them." He was very still. "I didn't hire them," she said quickly. "I need you to believe that. I did not hire someone to take those photographs. But I know who did because someone came to me before it happened, came to me with a proposition." "What kind of proposition?" She uncrossed her arms. Crossed them again, a nervous habit he'd never seen from her before. "They told me that there were people in your organization who were interested in the situation changing, and that photographs from the villa would be very useful for accelerating that change. And they offered me—" She stopped. "How much?" he said. 500,000. He absorbed that. "You turned it down," he said. "I turned it down." She met his eyes. "I want you to know that." "Who came to you?" She took a breath. "A man named Caruso. I didn't know him. He said he was representing a group of people. He gave me a number to call, and I didn't call it." Another breath. "But someone else took the photographs, Damien. Someone else took them and posted them, and I'm not responsible for that. But I've been sitting with this for 2 weeks because I don't know what to do with it, and you won't answer my calls, and I needed to tell you." He looked at her face. He was good at reading people, had spent 30 years sharpening the skill, and what he read in her face was not performance. She was frightened. Not of him exactly, of the situation, of the implications of what she'd just told him, which she'd clearly been turning over for 2 weeks. "Caruso," he said. That's the name he used. "Describe him." She did. Medium height, mid-50s, heavy through the chest, a scar on his left hand between the thumb and forefinger. Damien recognized nothing from the description. That meant either an outside contractor or someone careful enough to send a face that couldn't be traced. "You should have called me the moment he approached you," Damien said. "I know." She didn't apologize for it. She just said it plainly, "I know," which told him she'd made a calculation at the time and she wasn't pretending otherwise. "I thought it would go away. I thought if I didn't engage, it was over. And then someone posted the photographs anyway." "Yes." He sat with that. Someone inside the organization had been running a parallel operation. Not just Reyes feeding information to Ferraro. Not just Torrance making contact with the Calabrese side. Someone with the planning capacity and the resources to hire a photographer and approach Valentina and time the release of those images for maximum damage. Someone who understood the legitimate business connections well enough to know that 17 photographs with embedded timestamps would trigger investor flight within hours of publication. Someone who was not just opportunistically taking advantage of Damien's distraction, but who had been deliberately engineering the conditions of his collapse. This was not disorganized disloyalty. This was a coordinated removal. He stood up. "Don't tell anyone else about this conversation," he said. "Damien, no one. If someone asks you about the photographs again, tell them you don't know anything. Do not mention Caruso's name to anyone." She looked at him with something that was close to fear. "What are you going to do?" He picked up his jacket from the arm of the sofa. "I need you to think," he said, "about everyone you told about the villa. Anyone who knew we were going there, any conversation, any text, anything you mentioned to anyone before we left." She thought. He could see her working back through it, her eyes going slightly distant. "My assistant knew. I told her to hold my calls." She paused. "And Marcus, my manager. He handles my bookings, and I told him I'd be unavailable for the weekend." Marcus Hale. He'd heard that name, not in connection with Valentina, somewhere else. He couldn't place it yet. "Give me your phone," he said. "What?" "Your phone. I need to see your text from the week before the villa." She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she picked up the phone from the kitchen counter and handed it to him. He went through it quickly. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was looking for the thing that didn't fit, the slightly odd note, the text that explained too much or too little. He scrolled back through 3 weeks of messages, skimming, and then he stopped. A text from Valentina to Marcus Hale, sent on the Wednesday before the Villa weekend. Off Friday through Sunday. Cliff House with D, back Monday. Cliff House. A casual shorthand. She probably hadn't thought anything of it. And below it, Marcus's response, got it. Enjoy. And then below that, 20 minutes later, a number Damien didn't recognize. One line, let me know when you're back. Not Marcus's number. A different number, texted to Valentina 20 minutes after she'd told Marcus where she was going. He looked up at her. Who is this number? She leaned over to look at the screen and her face changed. I don't know that number. I didn't text that number. It texted you. I don't know who that is. She looked genuinely baffled, which was more alarming than if she'd recognized it. I never replied to it. He photographed the screen with his own phone. Marcus Hale, he said. How long has he managed you? 3 years. Why? Marcus wouldn't. I'm not saying he would, Damien said. I'm saying someone got to someone, and I'm going to find out the chain. He handed her phone back. You need to be somewhere else for a while. Not here. Not anywhere I've been with you. You're scaring me. You should be careful, he said. That's different from scared. He left. In the elevator, he called Marco and gave him Marcus Hale's name and told him to run it. Fast. Marco called back before Damien reached the lobby. Marcus Hale, Marco said. Born 1979. Talent management. Client list includes a brief pause. His mother is a Torrance. Damien stopped walking. Say that again. His mother. Barbara Hale, née Torrance. Anthony Torrance's first cousin. The elevator opened to the lobby. Damien stood in the marble lobby of Valentina's building with the phone pressed to his ear and felt the architecture of it resolve in his head with the horrible clarity of something that had been there the whole time, waiting to be seen. Torrance. Reyes. Caruso. The photographs. The investor timing, the commission session, the Ferraro incursion. Not separate problems. One problem, one coordinated operation, run from inside his own family, by men he had trusted and fed and protected for years, designed not just to destabilize him, but to remove him completely, to walk him to the edge of his own irrelevance, and then tip him over, and to do it in a way so thorough and multi-directional that by the time he understood what was happening, there would be nothing left to fight for. He had been managed, played, maneuvered, and Valentina, whether she knew it or not, had been part of the mechanism. Not a willing part, he believed her about that. But she had been introduced into his life at a specific time, by a specific chain of introductions he now needed to examine, and the Villa weekend had not been entirely spontaneous, she had suggested it, or had she? He was trying to remember now. He was going back through 6 months of what he'd understood as the natural progression of a relationship, and suddenly every point of it looked different, every turn and decision lit from a different angle. Had Valentina been placed? He stood in the marble lobby. 30 years. He had spent 30 years being the most dangerous man in any room he walked into. He walked to the car. Marco held the door. Get me Richard, Damien said. Not by phone. Where? Damien looked out the window of the car as it pulled into traffic, at the city moving past, at the ordinary and different mechanics of a Thursday evening, cabs and pedestrians and delivery trucks, and the particular quality of November light on wet pavement. Somewhere I choose, he said. Somewhere no one else knows about. Because he understood now, with the specific sickness of a man who has just seen the shape of everything he missed, that Richard Fenn had been his consigliere for 15 years, had known every meeting location, every contact, every operational detail, had sat in every room, had been the one to tell him about Reyes and Torrance, and had said, Damien, it's bad on the phone the night the commission email arrived, and Damien had heard that as loyalty, as a trusted man delivering difficult news, and now he was sitting in his car with a different question forming that he did not want to ask because of what the answer might be, asking himself very quietly in the part of his mind that dealt in cold facts rather than feelings. Who benefits most from my removal, and who has been closest to me long enough to engineer it? The place Damien chose was a warehouse in Red Hook that the Moretti family had owned through 3 shell companies since 2003 and had never used for anything that left a paper trail. It was cold inside. November had settled into the bones of the city, and the warehouse had no insulation worth mentioning. And the single work light Marco set up threw hard shadows across the concrete floor and made everything look like the inside of something that had already ended. Damien arrived first. He always arrived first. He stood in the center of the space with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and he went through it one more time in his head, the chain of it, the architecture, making sure he hadn't constructed something out of his own paranoia rather than out of evidence. Marcus Hale. Torrance connection. The unknown number texted to Valentina 20 minutes after she told Marcus about the villa. Caruso approaching Valentina with a proposition that required advanced knowledge of her relationship with Damien. The commission email arriving before any formal notice. Someone had sent it early. Someone with access to commission correspondence. The Reyes situation reported to Richard first, then to Damien, giving Richard 48 hours with that information before Damien had it. The Torrance contact with the Calabrese side, also surfaced by Richard. A consigliere who tells you about problems is doing his job. A consigliere who tells you about problems he helped create is doing something else entirely. He heard the door. Marco came in first, checked the space, nodded. Richard Fenn walked in behind him, dressed in his usual dark suit, moving with the measured gait of a man who was surprised by nothing, and showed it in the way he never moved too fast or too slow. He looked around the warehouse without comment and came to stand a few feet from Damien. Unusual location, Richard said. Yes, Damien said. The single work light sat between them, throwing both their faces into partial shadow. They had stood across from each other in rooms like this before, rooms chosen for their absence of witnesses, rooms where the conversation was the kind that didn't have a neutral outcome. They both knew the vocabulary of rooms like this. That was what 30 years of working together produced. Tell me about Marcus Hale, Damien said. Something moved across Richard's face. Not surprise. Something prior to surprise, something that preceded it, a fraction of a second in which a person understands that the ground has shifted before they've consciously identified how. I don't know the name, Richard said. Damien looked at him. In 30 years, he had seen Richard Fenn lie to federal investigators, to rival family representatives, to journalists, to judges. He was an excellent liar in all those contexts, fluid, detail-oriented, internally consistent. He was a significantly worse liar when the person he was lying to knew him well enough to see the machinery. You don't know the name, Damien said. No. Anthony Torrance's first cousin, talent manager, has been managing the woman I was seeing for 3 years. He watched Richard's face. You vetted her, Richard, 6 months ago when she first came into contact with me. You ran the standard background and you told me she was clean. Richard was quiet. Marcus Hale would have shown up in a thorough background, Damien said. Torrance connection. Anyone doing the job carefully would have flagged it. Background checks on social contacts aren't. Don't, Damien said. The word was quiet. It stopped Richard the way a locked door stops a hand. Don't tell me what background checks on social contacts normally include, Damien said. I know what they include. I've been running this organization for 30 years. You missed a Torrance family connection on a woman I was sleeping with, and you're about to tell me that's a clerical oversight. Richard looked at him. The warehouse was very quiet. Outside somewhere, a boat moved on the water, the cold pressed in from the walls. You should think very carefully, Damien said, about the next thing you say to me, because I'm going to tell you what I think happened, and you're going to have one opportunity to tell me something that changes my conclusion. Richard didn't say anything. Torrance came to you, Damien said, or you went to Torrance. At some point, someone in the organization decided that it was time for a change in leadership, and you decided that the person who had to survive that change was you. So you helped build the conditions. Valentina was introduced into my life through a chain of connections you could influence. The villa weekend. She suggested it, but someone suggested it to her first. The photographs were coordinated through Caruso, who Torrance's people hired, and you made sure my background check on Valentina missed the Hale connection so the chain couldn't be traced back. He stopped. And when things started moving, when Reyes talked to Ferraro, when the photographs came out, you were the one who brought it to me piece by piece, because a consigliere who surfaces problems looks like a loyal man, and it gave you control of the information. You decided what I knew and when I knew it. The warehouse was absolutely silent. Say something, Richard. Richard Fenn looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something Damien hadn't expected. He let go of the lie. You could see it happen, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, just a small release, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a while. You left her alone, Richard said, in a hospital, while she was having your child. Damien stared at him. That's your explanation. That's not an explanation, Richard said. I'm not explaining. I'm telling you what happened. You sat on a boat with a woman while your wife was screaming your name into a phone, and when the photographs came out and the investors left and the commission started asking questions, I had to sit in rooms and defend your judgment, and I couldn't. He said it without heat, flat, precise, exhausted. I couldn't defend it, because there is no defense. A man who makes that choice is not the man I signed on to work for. So you burned it down. I created conditions, Richard said. The organization would have destabilized regardless. I moved things along. You moved things along, Damien's voice was dangerously quiet. You worked with Torrance and Reyes and Ferraro's people to take apart 30 years of what we built together, and your justification is that I was a bad husband. My justification is that you stopped being fit to lead. Marco, 3 steps behind Richard, was watching Damien's face. He had been with Damien long enough to read the particular quality of stillness that preceded the most consequential decisions. He was reading it now. Damien breathed in through his nose. Who else? He said. In the commission. Who knew? Richard was quiet for a moment. Then, Amodei was not involved. Capello was not involved. Trask? A pause. Trask was made aware. Not a full picture. Enough. Trask, Harvard-educated, 3rd generation, had sat across that table at the Arcadia and said very little while Amodei ran the session. And Ferraro. Ferraro was opportunistic, Richard said. He didn't know the full scope. He just knew there was an opening and he took it. And your plan, Damien said. What comes after me? A structured transition, controlled. The organization stays intact, just under different management. Your management. Richard didn't answer that directly. He didn't need to. Damien looked at the man he had worked beside for 15 years, had trusted with his operational architecture, his financial structures, his family's security, had brought into rooms where the conversations could have ended both their lives if they'd gone wrong, had sat with at the hospital when his father died 15 years ago, and Richard had handed him a glass of terrible vending machine coffee and said nothing, which had been the exact right thing to do, 15 years. You should know, Damien said, that I'm not going to do what you expect me to do in this room. Something shifted in Richard's posture, a barely perceptible tightening. I'm not going to hurt you, Damien said. Not here. Not tonight. He watched Richard absorb that, the relief that moved across his face, immediately followed by the more complicated question of what it meant. I'm going to give you 48 hours to close whatever arrangements you've made and get out of the city. Because what you said about Elena is the only thing in this room that I can't entirely argue with, and I'm choosing to let that count for something. Richard looked at him. That's not business logic, Richard said. No, Damien agreed. It's not. A long silence. You're going to go to the commission, Richard said, with what you know. That's between me and the commission. Richard nodded once. He was pale. Some of the structural confidence had left his face, and what was underneath it was older and more tired. He looked, Damien thought, like a man who had been carrying a very large decision for a long time and had now put it down and wasn't entirely sure he was relieved. 48 hours, Damien said. Richard left. Marco stepped forward. You want me to let him go, Damien said. Damien, I said let him go. He turned and looked at the warehouse wall, the cold brick, the shadows thrown by the work light. Get me Trask's number. Not through any channel Richard touched. Personal. Somewhere clean. I'll find it. And Marco. He turned back. I need you to do something for me that has nothing to do with any of this. Marco waited. Elena's security. The details she fired when she left the house. She refused the replacement I offered. I need someone watching the brownstone in Brooklyn. Not close. Not visible. Just watching. And if anything changes in the situation with Torrance or the Calabrese people or anyone else, I need to know immediately. Marco nodded. No question, no commentary. She doesn't know, Damien said. It wasn't a question. She won't, Marco said. Damien picked up his coat from the chair where he'd draped it and put it on and walked out of the warehouse into the November night, into the smell of the harbor and the distant sound of the city. And he stood on the dock for a moment looking at the black water. He had 48 hours before Richard's arrangements continued to move without Richard directing them. He had a commission session coming in 2 weeks that was no longer a warning but a formal review of his standing. He had Trask to deal with. He had Torrance, who now knew that Reyes had been surfaced and would be calculating what that meant for his own position. He had a legitimate business infrastructure that had lost $68 million, and needed to demonstrate stability before it lost more. And somewhere in Brooklyn, his son was 7 weeks old and didn't know his father's name yet. He had a lot of work to do. He started moving. The next 72 hours ran on coffee and 4 hours of sleep per night, and the specific compressed focus that Damien Moretti had always been able to produce under extreme pressure. A narrowing of everything to the task in front of him, a temporary suspension of everything peripheral, a state that his body knew how to maintain for short periods, and that always left him slightly hollowed out on the other side. He got Trask's number through a contact Marco found in the financial sector. A man who owed the Moretti family a significant favor and was happy to produce a cell number in exchange for that favor's cancellation. The call with Trask lasted 11 minutes. Trask's voice was careful from the first word. The voice of a man who understood that receiving this call meant the situation had developed in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I was informed in general terms," Trask said. "I want to be clear about that. I was told there might be instability in the Moretti organization and that the commission should be ready to act. I was not told the mechanism." "You didn't ask," Damien said. A pause. "No, I didn't ask. I need to know whether your position at the Thursday session was directive or observational." "Observational," Trask said. Then after a moment, "Mostly." "And now?" Another pause, longer. The sound of a man recalculating in real time. "What are you offering?" "Information," Damien said, "about how the instability was created, who created it, and what they intended to do with the organization after my removal. All of it documented, verifiable. And in exchange, an honest account to the commission of what you knew and when. Not who told you. I'm not asking you to expose sources. Just a correction of the record about whether what they saw in the last 6 weeks was organic destabilization or a managed operation." A very long pause. "You have documentation," Trask said. "I will have documentation," Damien said. "By Tuesday." "That's 4 days." "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Call me Tuesday." He hung up. He had 4 days. The documentation came from 3 sources, and assembling it required the kind of methodical evidence gathering that Damien had always been better at than anyone gave him credit for. People saw the power and the reputation and assumed the bluntness, missed the patience underneath. The first source was the phone records. The unknown number that had texted Valentina after Marcus Hale was traced through a contact in the carrier's billing department. A trace that was not legal and was not conducted in any way that would produce court-admissible evidence. But that produced the information Damien needed, which was a different thing. The number traced to a prepaid device purchased in New Jersey. The purchase transaction, obtained through the same extra-legal channel, showed a credit card. The credit card, through one more step, showed a name. Not Caruso. Not Marcus Hale. Not Torrance. A name Damien hadn't expected, which told him there was another layer he hadn't fully mapped yet. The name was Elena's attorney's personal assistant. He sat with that for a long time. It didn't mean Catherine Hughes was involved. It almost certainly meant her personal assistant had been approached and compromised. Someone inside Hughes's office who had access to Elena's case files, to correspondence, to the financial documentation Elena had been gathering, which meant someone had been reading Elena's divorce strategy in real time, which meant the operation against Damien had been watching his vulnerabilities from multiple directions simultaneously, including through his own wife's legal proceedings. The cold that moved through him when he understood that was not about himself. It was about Elena. She didn't know. She was in a Brooklyn brownstone building a careful new life, working with her attorney in the belief that those conversations were private, and someone had been reading them. Someone had been watching her the way you watch a flank, not as a target, but as a window into the opposing position. He picked up the phone. He put it back down. Calling Elena was not something he could do right now. Not the way things stood between them. She wouldn't believe him, or she would believe him, and it would frighten her, or she would take it as a manipulation. Another angle, another pressure point. There was no version of that phone call that didn't make things worse in one direction or another. He needed to handle it differently. He spent 4 hours on the evidence, then called Marco. "The brownstone," he said. "Nothing unusual," Marco said. "She went to the park this morning, came back, Carmen's there." "There's a compromise inside Catherine Hughes's office," Damien said. "Personal assistant level. I need you to get me a name, and I need it without anyone at Hughes's firm knowing we're looking." Marco absorbed that without visible reaction. "I'll work it." "And Marco, if anyone moves near that brownstone, anyone, I don't care what else is happening." "Understood," Marco said. Damien went back to the documentation. I was at his desk at 1 in the morning on Monday, when his phone rang, and he almost didn't answer it because he was deep in a financial document and the number was unfamiliar, and he had learned in the past 3 weeks to be selective about unfamiliar numbers. He answered it. Mr. Moretti, a woman's voice. Composed, professional. My name is Catherine Hughes. He sat back. Ms. Hughes, he said. I'm going to say something to you that I want to be clear about, she said. This call is my personal decision. It is not authorized by my client, and if she knew I was making it, she would likely be furious with me. I'm making it anyway because I think you need to know something. He was very still. Go ahead. My personal assistant has been terminated this evening, she said. I discovered earlier today that she had been providing copies of client correspondence to an outside party. I don't know the full scope yet, but your wife's file was among the affected materials. A pause. Elena doesn't know yet. I'm going to tell her tomorrow morning. I'm calling you tonight because whoever is doing this, whatever is happening on your side of things, I need you to understand that your wife and your son are in a brownstone in Brooklyn, and if the situation around you is as unstable as it appears from the outside, that matters. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. She's safe, he said. You know that? Yes. A pause. I'm going to hold you to that. You can. Another pause longer, and he heard in it a woman making a calculation about character, reading him through the phone the way attorneys learn to read people, through what they say and what they don't, and how long the silences last. My client, Hughes said finally, has been very clear about what she wants. I'm not calling you to open a negotiation. I'm calling you because she has a son who is 8 weeks old, and I needed to know you were aware of the situation. I appreciate the call, Damien said. He meant it completely. Don't make me regret it, she said, and hung up. He put the phone down. He sat in his office in the quiet of 1 a.m. and thought about Elena in the brownstone. Elena, who didn't know her attorney's office had been compromised. Elena, who was rebuilding her life with the focused competence she brought to everything and who had no idea that she had been an unwitting instrument in the architectural demolition of her husband's empire. Then he picked up the phone and called Marco and said, Double the detail on the brownstone tonight. I don't care what it costs. Done, Marco said. And find out where Torrance is, right now, tonight. A pause. He's at his place in Westchester. Is he alone? No, he has 4 men with him. That was a different number than usual. 4 men in Westchester at 1 in the morning meant Torrance knew the situation was moving. Meant he'd heard something. Maybe that Reyes had been surfaced. Maybe that the warehouse meeting had happened. Maybe that Damien was still operational when Torrance had been expecting him to be significantly more destabilized by now. 4 men in Westchester meant Torrance was preparing for something. Tell me the moment he moves, Damien said. He didn't sleep. He worked through the documentation until 4 a.m., assembled it into a package that was thorough enough to lay before the commission with confidence, and then he sat at his desk with a cold cup of coffee and looked at the city outside the window and thought about the specific nature of what was still left to resolve. The commission was Tuesday. Torrance was in Westchester with 4 men. Richard was somewhere, out of the city, presumably, using the 48 hours Damien had given him. And in the morning, he needed to do something that had nothing to do with any of it, and that he had been putting off for 8 weeks because he didn't know how to do it correctly and was afraid that doing it incorrectly would be worse than not doing it at all. He needed to talk to Elena. Not about the Hughes office, not about the security detail, not about any of the machinery of what was happening on his side of things. He just needed to talk to her. He picked up the phone. He put it back down. At 4:30 in the morning, he finally admitted to himself that he wasn't going to sleep and went to make more coffee, and while he was standing in the kitchen of the mansion that felt like the world's most expensive empty building, his phone buzzed on the counter. Marco. He grabbed it. What? Torrance is moving, Marco said. Left the Westchester property 20 minutes ago. 4 cars. Direction. South, into the city. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. The brownstone, he said. I don't know yet. Get there, Damien said, and he was already moving, already through the kitchen and into the hallway, coat in his hand, keys in the other. Get there now. I'm right behind you. He ran. For the first time in 30 years, Damien Moretti ran. Not from something, toward something. Down the hallway of the mansion he had bought to demonstrate his power, through the front door into the November night, into the car that he drove himself because there was no time, because 4 cars leaving Westchester at 4 in the morning had one destination, and he knew what it was, and he knew why. Not because Torrance wanted to hurt Elena. Because Torrance knew that Damien's one genuine vulnerability, the thing that could stop a man in his tracks faster than any legal threat or organizational maneuver, was not his empire. It was the woman in the Brooklyn brownstone who didn't know her husband was coming. He drove through the empty streets of the city at 4:30 a.m., running red lights, and he called Marco and said, "Give me updates every 2 minutes." And Marco said, "They're on the bridge." And Damien pushed the car harder, and the city blurred past on both sides. And he thought about 8 weeks old and dark hair and the grip of tiny fingers around his, and he drove like he was trying to get somewhere he should have been a long time ago. Marco called at 4:47. "They're on Elena's block," Marco said, and his voice was tight in a way Damien had never heard from him in 12 years. "How far out am I?" 4 minutes. "Are my people there?" 2 of them. They clocked the cars. They're positioned, but Damien, it's 4 cars and we have 2 men. He was on the bridge, the lights of Brooklyn ahead, the water black underneath. "Call the brownstone," he said. "We don't have the number. Carmen has a cell. Find it. Call it. Wake them up and tell them to stay inside and away from the windows." He was off the bridge, into Brooklyn, running through empty intersections. "Do it now." On it. He could see the block now, 3 blocks away. 2. The 4 cars Torrance had brought were dark SUVs, parked at intervals along the street, and in the gray pre-dawn light he could see movement near the brownstone entrance, and his chest was doing something he didn't have language for. A physical constriction, a full-body alarm that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the specific terror of a man who has just understood what he stands to lose. He brought the car to a hard stop at the end of the block and got out. The cold air hit his face. He could see Marco's men, 2 of them, positioned near the brownstone steps, body language conveying that they had identified the 4 Torrance vehicles and were calculating odds that were not in their favor. He could see, emerging from the lead SUV, Anthony Torrance himself. Torrance saw him at the same moment. Across the length of a Brooklyn block at 4:50 in the morning, they looked at each other, and in that look was 30 years of the city and everything it produced. The alliances and the betrayals and the blood and the money and the specific clarifying simplicity of 2 men who had arrived at the same place from opposite directions and now had to decide what happened next. Torrance took a step forward. Damien took a step forward. And in the brownstone behind them, on the 3rd floor, a light came on. The distance between them was 40 feet and a decade of accumulated miscalculation. Torrance walked slowly. He had always walked slowly, even in situations that called for speed. It was the thing about him that Damien had once interpreted as composure, and now understood as something colder, the unhurried movement of a man who had already decided outcomes before the room got loud. He had 4 men with him, spread across the sidewalk in the loose formation of people who weren't trying to look like what they were and weren't trying very hard not to. Damien stood at the end of the block with the November wind in his face and no coat because he'd left it in the car and his hands at his sides, open, which was either the posture of a man who wasn't armed or a man who was armed and confident enough not to need the visual warning. He was armed. Marco's 2 men held their positions near the brownstone steps, which meant Torrance's 4 would have to go through them to get to the door, which bought 60 seconds at most. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The light on the 3rd floor was still on. "Damien," Torrance said, when he was close enough that they didn't have to raise their voices. He said the name the way you say the name of someone you've already filed in the past tense. "You look like a man who drove very fast." "You look like a man who made a very poor decision tonight," Damien said. Torrance stopped 8 feet away. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He was wearing a good coat, charcoal gray, the kind of coat that said he'd had time to dress before leaving Westchester, which meant this wasn't a reactive move. He'd been planning to come tonight, the 4 cars already arranged, the timing chosen. "The brownstone was a message," Torrance said, "not an action." "A message," Damien said, "that the situation is further along than you think it is. That going to the commission with whatever you've assembled isn't going to produce the result you're expecting." He paused. "Richard called me." Damien absorbed that without showing it. "Richard told me you let him walk," Torrance said. He was surprised. So was I. He tilted his head slightly. "That's not who you are, Damien, letting someone walk. Which makes me think you let him walk because you needed him to make a phone call." 1 second of silence. 2. You used him as a wire, Torrance said, to get me out of Westchester. He looked almost, not quite, but almost, impressed. The brownstone was never the point. You needed me in the city. Damien looked at him. And now you have me, Torrance said. So, Damien said. They stood there in the 4:50 morning, two men who had known each other for over a decade, who had eaten at the same tables and protected the same territories and built the same structure from different positions inside it, and between them was everything that had happened and everything that was about to. The documentation I have, Damien said, goes to Victor Amode at 6 this morning, in 3 hours. It covers the origin and architecture of the last 6 weeks. Your role, Richard's role, the Hale connection, the photographer, Caruso, the commission leak, the Hughes office compromise. He watched Torrance's face. All of it. Sourced. Verifiable. I have people inside the commission. You have Trask, Damien said. And Trask called me back on Tuesday, and we had a conversation that I recorded. He paused. He's cooperative, Anthony. As of 2 days ago, he's fully cooperative. Something changed in Torrance's face. Not collapse. The man had too much control for collapse. But something receded. A structural element, quietly failing. The question I want to ask you, Damien said, is whether we do this the hard way or the straightforward way. There's a straightforward way. You get in those 4 cars and you drive back to Westchester and you wait for the commission to contact you. You cooperate with what follows. Your people go home tonight. Torrance looked at him, cold air between them, the city making its distant, indifferent sounds. And the hard way, Torrance said. The hard way involves what you came here to start, and we both know how that ends. And it ends in a way where the only people who benefit are the Ferraro family and every other organization that has been watching the Moretti territories and hoping for exactly this kind of opening. Damien let that land. You want to burn this down, Anthony. Burn it so completely that there's nothing left. You'll get your wish. But there won't be anything for you to take over either. Torrance was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved past Damien, briefly, just a glance, to the brownstone, to the lit window on the 3rd floor. She doesn't know you're out here, Torrance said. No. Interesting. He said it quietly, mostly to himself. Then he looked back at Damien. You came across a bridge at 4 in the morning. For her. I came for my son, Damien said. She happens to be in the same building. Something moved across Torrance's face that was almost, in different circumstances, in a different life, something like recognition. Go home, Anthony, Damien said. A long silence. Long enough that one of Torrance's men shifted his weight, which was the small human signal of uncertainty, of waiting too long without instruction. Then Torrance nodded once. He turned and walked back to the lead SUV and got in, and the 4 cars pulled away from the block in sequence and drove north, and the sound of them faded, and the street was quiet and cold and empty. Marco appeared at Damien's elbow. He had materialized the way Marco always materialized, suddenly present, no transition, as if he'd always been standing there. That's it, Marco said. That's the opening, Damien said. The commission does the rest. He stood on the sidewalk for another moment. He looked up at the brownstone. The light on the 3rd floor was still on. He thought about going to the door. He stood there for a while thinking about it. Then he got in his car and drove home. The commission session on Tuesday lasted 2 hours. Damien sat before the same 5 men in the same room at the Arcadia Club and presented the documentation with the same precision he'd brought to every critical moment of his professional life. Clear, sequential, evidenced, leaving nothing inferential that could be made concrete. Victor Amode read through 40 pages of material without comment. Capello asked 3 questions. Trask said very little, which was the right thing for Trask to say. Ferraro tried to speak twice and was silenced by Amode both times with nothing more than a look. When it was over, Amode sat back in his chair and looked at Damien with those patient, undeceivable eyes and said, The commission will address the individuals involved. You understand that the process is ours to manage. I understand, Damien said. And the Moretti organization. Amade paused. The question of its leadership going forward. Yes. You're asking us to confirm your standing. I'm asking the commission to make the determination it believes is correct, Damien said, based on the full picture, not the picture that was constructed for you. Amade looked at him for a long time. The look of a man who had been reading other men's character for 60 years and had long since developed the patience to simply wait until the thing he was looking for appeared. "The full picture," he said, "includes the night your wife delivered your son." "Yes," Damien said, "it does." "That doesn't change." "No," Damien said, "it doesn't." Amadi nodded slowly. "I appreciate the honesty." The commission deliberated for 40 minutes in a separate room. When they came back, Amadi sat down and folded his hands and said that the formal review of the Moretti organization's leadership was being closed, that the coordinated action against the organization constituted a violation of commission protocols and would be addressed accordingly, and that the Moretti family's standing and territorial authority were confirmed. Torrance would be handled. Reyes was already gone. The Ferraro incursion would require a negotiated remedy, the terms of which the commission would oversee. It was over, or the first version of it was over. Damien walked out of the Arcadia Club into a Tuesday afternoon that was cold and bright in equal measure, and Marco was waiting with the car, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his pockets and felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not relief, not the specific satisfaction that used to come at the end of a resolved crisis. Just a tiredness that was very thorough and very honest about what it was. He had won the thing he'd set out to win. He wasn't sure it was the thing that mattered. He got in the car. "Where to?" Marco said. Damien looked out the window. "Brooklyn," he said. He called first this time. He sat in the car 2 blocks from the brownstone and called Elena's number and listened to it ring, once, twice, 3 times, and prepared himself to leave a voicemail that he hadn't decided on the words for yet, and then she picked up. "Damien." Not a question. She'd seen the name on the screen and answered anyway, which he recognized as its own kind of information. "I need to tell you some things," he said. "About the last few weeks. About what's been happening." He paused. "Not to change anything. Not to renegotiate anything between us. You deserve to know because it involves you directly." A silence on her end. He heard, faintly, the sound of the baby. Lucas. Some small noise that babies made, effortless and complete. "How directly?" she said. "Your attorney's office was compromised. Hughes already knows, she fired the assistant and she's going to call you today if she hasn't already. But there's more context and I want to give it to you." A longer silence. "Are you close?" she said. He looked out the window. 2 blocks. "Yes." "Come to the door," she said, and then, before he could respond, "Carmen is here. And I'm not... This isn't an opening, Damien. I need you to understand that." "I understand," he said. "Come to the door," she said again, and hung up. Carmen let him in, which told him Elena had asked her to, which told him something about how the last 2 minutes had landed. Carmen had her sister's eyes, and none of her sister's particular brand of controlled composure. She looked at Damien with the specific expression of an older sister who had spent 8 weeks watching Elena rebuild something from rubble and was not interested in anyone disturbing the construction site. "She's in the living room," Carmen said. "I'm going to be in the kitchen." "Thank you, Carmen." "Don't thank me," she said, and went to the kitchen. Elena was sitting on the sofa with Lucas in her arms, which Damien suspected was deliberate. The baby as both purpose and buffer. Something real and present that made the conversation about the right things rather than the wrong ones. She looked up when he came in and didn't smile and didn't not smile. Just looked at him with those clear, measuring eyes that had always been able to see more of him than he was comfortable with. He sat down in the chair across from her. Not on the sofa. The chair was the right distance. Lucas was awake, doing the wide-eyed inventory that 8-week-olds conduct of the world. And when Damien came into his field of vision, he stared with the focused intensity of someone encountering something that required significant processing. "Hi," Damien said quietly to his son. Lucas continued his assessment. Damien told Elena everything, not the operational details. He didn't give her the structure of the commission or the mechanism of what had happened with Torrance and Reyes, because those were not her problems, and she hadn't asked to inherit them. What he told her was what she needed to know. That her file had been read by people connected to an internal conflict in his organization, that the conflict was resolved, that her attorney was already informed, that it would not happen again. He told her about the brownstone at 4:50 in the morning. She was quiet for a moment when he finished. She was looking at Lucas rather than at him, doing the absent, attentive thing that new mothers did, tracking the baby's breathing, the baby's expression, without breaking the conversation. "You drove across the bridge at 5 in the morning," she said. "Yes." For your son. He remembered saying that to Torrance. Yes. She looked up at him. And for me. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. She looked back down at Lucas. I'm not changing my mind, she said. About any of it. I want you to hear that clearly. I hear it. The divorce moves forward. The custody arrangement that Catherine is drafting. I want that to be fair. I've told her to make it fair. You should be in his life. That was never the question. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me for that, she said. He needs his father. That's not a gift I'm giving you. It's just the truth. She shifted Lucas slightly in her arms. What I can't give you is the marriage. I gave you 8 years of it, and I gave you everything I had, and I don't have more. She said it plainly, without cruelty, the way you state something that has simply become fact. That's gone. That was gone before any of this, the photographs, the other woman. It was gone before all of that. I think you know that. Yes, he said. I know that. They sat in the small Brooklyn living room, two people who had been something to each other for a decade, sitting across an uncrossable distance with a child between them who would spend his whole life navigating the space they hadn't been able to bridge. There's something I want to say, Damien said. And then I'll go. She waited. I knew I was losing you before I lost you, he said. I knew it, and I didn't. I couldn't figure out how to be the person who deserved to keep you. And instead of figuring that out, I made choices that made it worse. And the night you needed me most, I was somewhere making myself comfortable. He stopped. He had rehearsed various versions of this for weeks and had discarded all of them because they sounded like arguments, like the opening moves of a campaign to change her mind. And that wasn't what this was. I'm not saying it to ask for anything. I'm saying it because you spent 8 years hearing things that weren't true from me, and I want to give you one true thing before we close this out. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in front of him, he realized, in all of this. Not once. She had been devastatingly, consistently composed, and he understood that the composure wasn't coldness. It was the structure she'd built to stay upright. I know you knew, she said finally. I think that's the part that took me the longest to accept. Not that you made mistakes, that you saw them and kept going anyway. That landed exactly where it was supposed to land. Yes, he said. She nodded once. Thank you for being honest. He stood up. He looked at his son one more time, the dark hair, the jaw, the eyes that were tracking him now with that focused, baffled infant attention, trying to solve the problem of a face it didn't know well enough yet. Can I hold him before I go? He said. She looked at him, then at Lucas, then held the baby out. Damien took him. He was heavier than the first time, 8 weeks of growing into himself, and he fit differently in Damien's arms than he had on that first morning, more present somehow, more certain of his own weight. He looked up at Damien's face with the frank, unembarrassed curiosity of someone who had no context for disappointment yet. Hey, Lucas, Damien said quietly. Lucas made a sound, small, uninterpretable, probably about gas. But Damien chose to interpret it as something else. He held him for 3 minutes. He counted them without meaning to. Then he handed him back to Elena and put on his coat and said goodbye to Carmen in the kitchen, who looked at him with slightly less hostility than she had on the way in, which he decided to accept as progress. He walked out of the brownstone into the November afternoon. He stood on the stoop for a moment. He breathed. Then he walked to the car. The year that followed was the hardest of his life, and he was a man who had lived through things that would have dismantled most people. The Commission's handling of Torrance and Reyes was swift and not gentle, in the way Commission actions tended to be when the violation was internal and well documented. Torrance's organization was restructured under Commission supervision, his authority reduced to a northern territory so small it was barely symbolic. Reyes had left the city and didn't come back. Richard Fenn disappeared into a quieter life somewhere that Damien made no effort to identify. The legitimate business losses were slower to recover. The $68 million didn't come back all at once. Some of it came back. Some of it was replaced by different investors who came in after the situation stabilized, attracted by the same things that had attracted the first round. The Moretti name, the Moretti infrastructure, the specific track record of a man who had built something durable through several decades of very difficult conditions. The Ferraro negotiation took 4 months and required Damien to give things he didn't want to give. That was the cost. He paid it. The divorce was finalized in March. Catherine Hughes had indeed made it thorough. The financial settlement was significant. Elena took what was fair, nothing more, which turned out to be a considerable amount when calculated correctly, and which Damien paid without contest because she had earned every dollar of it, and he knew it, and his attorney knew it, and the only question had been the numbers. The custody arrangement gave him Wednesday evenings, every other weekend, and the flexibility to add time as Lucas got older and the situation evolved. It was not enough. I was not going to pretend it was enough. But it was what he had, and what he had was more than he deserved, and he understood the math of that. He showed up. That was what he could offer, and he offered it fully. Showed up for every Wednesday, every other weekend, on time, sober, present, in the way he had never been present in his marriage because he had not yet understood what presence cost, and what its absence cost more. Lucas was not an easy baby. He was opinionated in the way that certain babies are, with clear preferences about sound and movement and the specific angle at which he wanted to be held. And when these preferences were not met, he communicated his dissatisfaction with the vocal conviction of someone who had important things to say and resented the limitations of pre-language. Damien learned him slowly, learned the specific hold that quieted him, learned that he liked being walked rather than rocked, that he responded to low voices more than high ones, that he had his mother's stubbornness and his father's jaw, and some third quality that belonged to neither of them, something entirely his own that was still forming. He took him to the park on Wednesday evenings when the weather allowed. He sat on a bench and held his son and watched the city move around them and felt the specific quality of time that he had never experienced before. Not rushed, not strategic, not pointed toward an outcome. Just present. Just this. The weight of a child on his chest and the sound of the park, and the November turning into December turning into the spring, and the spring turning into something longer. Elena was civil. She was not warm, which he didn't expect, but she was never hostile in front of Lucas, never weaponized the handoffs, never made the logistics a battleground. She had moved with Carmen to a larger apartment in Park Slope by spring, funded partly by the settlement and partly by the business she had begun building, a nonprofit, as it turned out, working with single mothers navigating family court, leveraging her law background and her own particular experience in a direction that would not have existed if the last year had gone differently. He read about it in a profile. A local Brooklyn publication did a piece on the organization in the summer. He read it 3 times. There was a photograph of her with Lucas on her hip at some kind of outdoor event, talking to another woman, and in the photograph she looked, he sat with the word for a while before he found it, she looked full. The way people look when they are doing exactly the thing they are supposed to be doing with their life. When the work and the person have found each other accurately. He was glad for her. He was also grieved by the gladness because it confirmed what she had told him, that she was not diminished by this year, was not surviving it, was actively becoming more herself than she had been inside the marriage, which meant that the marriage had been containing something that needed more room than he had given it. He had made her smaller. She had said it in the hospital, and he had heard it, and now he could see the evidence, the profile, the work, the photograph. And he understood it as fact. He put the article down. He went to pick up Lucas. The evening that settled something in him happened in the second autumn, when Lucas was almost 2. He arrived at Elena's apartment for the Wednesday pickup and rang the bell and heard, through the door, Lucas's voice, that opinionated, fully committed toddler voice, saying something with great urgency and conviction that Damien couldn't quite make out through the door, and then Elena's voice, lower, patient, and then the sound of small running feet. The door opened and Lucas was right there, looking up at him with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw and the completely unembarrassed joy of a child who has not yet learned to hedge his own enthusiasm. "Da," Lucas said. He had been saying it for 3 months and still deployed it with the same conviction every time, as if discovering the category fresh. "Hey, buddy," Damien said. He crouched down to Lucas's level. Lucas put both hands on Damien's face immediately, in the property-claiming way toddlers handled things they considered theirs. His palms were slightly sticky, which was information about the afternoon. "What did you get into?" Damien said. "Juice," Elena said from behind Lucas, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, and the very slight, involuntary upward movement at the corner of her mouth that meant she was suppressing something. "He got into the juice situation." "How bad?" "The kitchen will recover," she said. Lucas was still holding Damien's face between his hands, examining him seriously, as if conducting an audit. "He ate. He's had a bath. He needs to be in bed by 8, Elena said. "He's in his skipping nap phase, so he'll be tired earlier than he acts." "Understood," She looked at her son for a moment, then at Damien, and the particular thing that moved across her face in that moment was not warm exactly, but it was real. A kind of recognition, maybe, of the thing that they had made together that neither of them could unmake, and neither of them, at this point, wanted to. "He's been asking for you," she said. It cost her something to say it. He could tell by the way she said it directly rather than at an angle. "The last few days, he asks where Da is." Damien looked down at Lucas, who was now trying to inspect the inside of his ear. "I'll be here," Damien said. "I'm going to keep being here." She nodded once. "I know," she said. And then, because she was Elena and had never learned to be dishonest even when honesty was harder, "That's the thing that's changed." He looked at her. "Before all of this," she said, "I was never sure you'd be there when I needed you, and now—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "I don't need you to be there for me anymore. But for him, you're there." A pause. "That's not a small thing." "No," he said, "it's not." Lucas decided the ear audit was complete and turned his attention to Damien's jacket zipper, which was apparently more interesting. "I'll have him back by 8:30, Damien said. 8:15, she said. "He'll fight you on the bedtime. Don't let him win." "He fights me every time." "Because you let him win every time." He stood up with Lucas in his arms. "I'm working on it." "Work faster," she said, but the corner of her mouth did the thing again. He carried his son down the steps of the apartment building into the autumn evening, the city in that particular October light that makes everything look like the last good day of something, and Lucas pointed at a bus going past and said something in his own dedicated language that Damien had learned to receive as information even when he couldn't fully decode it. "Yeah," Damien said, "big bus." Lucas considered this, found it satisfactory. They walked to the park because Lucas walked everywhere he could on his own feet now, and the walk was important. The walk was the point. The small hand in his larger one, the periodic stops to examine a crack in the sidewalk, or a dog, or a leaf that had made an interesting landing. The city moved around them the way it always moved, enormous and indifferent, and inside that enormity, Damien Moretti walked with his son at the pace a 2-year-old sets, which is the pace of someone for whom the entire world is still remarkable. He thought about the night he had driven across the bridge. He thought about the delivery room he hadn't been in. He thought about 14 missed calls in a nurse's hand, and the way Elena had said, "His name is Lucas," with that quiet, unbudgeable finality. He thought about 30 years of building an empire, and the specific night he had looked at his phone, seen his wife's name, and chosen the glass instead. He wasn't going to stop thinking about it. That was what he had come to understand over the course of this year, that the reckoning wasn't a single event, a moment of clarity that cleared the debt. The reckoning was ongoing. It was every Wednesday evening and every other weekend. It was the gap between what he had been and what he was trying to become, and the honest daily acknowledgement that the gap existed. It was being there, just being there. Lucas stopped on the sidewalk to examine something, a bottle cap, silver, lying near the curb. He picked it up with great seriousness and held it out to Damien for inspection. Damien took it, turned it over. "Good find," he said. Lucas appeared satisfied with this assessment. He took the bottle cap back and held it carefully in his fist. They went to the park. They stayed until the light went. Damien got him home by 8:12, which he considered a professional accomplishment, and Elena opened the door and looked at Lucas's face and then at Damien's and said nothing, which was its own kind of language, and he handed his son over and said goodnight and walked back down the steps. At the bottom he paused. Not for long. Not for anything dramatic. Just long enough to stand in the autumn night and understand without ceremony or consolation exactly where he was. Not the man he'd been, not the man he might have been if he'd made different choices. Just the man standing here, on these steps, in this city, at this hour. The man his choices had made, doing the work his failures required, one Wednesday at a time. The light went out in the downstairs window. He walked to his car. The city moved around him the way it always had, enormous and indifferent and completely unconcerned with any individual's version of redemption. He drove home through it, alone, and the drive was neither triumph nor defeat. It was just what his life looked like now. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, that was enough to move toward.